Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving into, well, a really fascinating challenge in cognitive and affective neuroscience. We're looking at the intricate neurobiological network that governs complex decision-making, especially when someone's faced with profound psychological stress. Specifically, we're examining the architecture of recovery from what the source material calls moral injury.
Right, and the material uses this quite helpful multi-layered framework. It talks about these brain regions as a kind of collaborative group of specialized friends, which is useful, actually. It lets us discuss very specific structures, the anterior cingulate cortex, the supramammillary nucleus, the hemisphime, but in the context of their integrated function during crises, like those Lego friends working together.
Exactly. Our debate today, though, needs to clarify the functional hierarchy within this network. So the central question we're tackling is this. Is the anterior cingulate cortex, the ASC, the principal integrative mechanism necessary for resolving moral injury? Is it the essential coordinator, the Lego planner, for ethical and emotional reframing? Or, and this is the counterpoint, are the deep subcortical mechanisms and the molecular architecture, things like the supramammillary nucleus and the insights from Omics data, actually the primary non-negotiable determinants of that immediate response and, crucially, long-term recovery? My position is that the ASC, the cognitive planner, is really the indispensable hub for reaching resolution.
Okay, I'm going to argue for a more foundational perspective. I think the efficacy of any high-level planning or reframing by the ASC is ultimately constrained by the fidelity, the accuracy, really, and stability of the underlying physiological systems. So I'll be arguing that these foundational processes, including that immediate startle effect driven by the supramammillary nucleus and the molecular architecture revealed by this omics era, provide the critical bedrock. Without that solid foundation, sustained recovery is, much harder to achieve.
Okay, so when we analyze the challenge of overcoming moral injury, that internal conflict, that feeling of hurt inside from a perceived transgression, we're essentially looking for the mechanism that can synthesize these really profound emotional and ethical inputs into a cohesive path forward, one that isn't self-destructive. This needs an emergent functionality, something more than just adding up the parts. The anterior cingulate cortex, the ASC, which, the source material nicely calls the central planner or the group heart. It really has to be this central mechanism. The ASC is, I think, uniquely positioned. Why? Because it integrates the complex emotional weight coming from the orbitofrontal cortex, that's the decision detective in the analogy, with contextual memory matching from the anterior ventral temporal cortex, or AVTC. Its critical role, as the source puts it, is making sure nobody is left out when they are upset or scared. What that means neurobiologically is that it provides the essential emotional and social context needed to move beyond just, calculating utility and into actual ethical decision-making. Overcoming trauma requires this ability to talk about feelings and choices, which is a hallmark of ASC function. And that makes it the essential target for cognitive and behavioral regulation during recovery.
Okay, I see why you prioritize that top-down integration, that sort of conscious coordination, but let me offer a slightly different perspective on where the real determination lies. The ASC's ability to coordinate feelings and plan, it's fundamentally dependent on the precision and the stability of the signals it's receiving from below, right? If the input is chaotic, the best-laid plans, they fail. Think about the immediate crisis phase, that instantaneous, almost precognitive response, the startle effect, which is driven by the supramammillary nucleus, the SMN, the brain's surprise sensor. This mechanism triggers the entire crisis response cascade. It sets the initial parameters for decision-making before the ASC is even fully engaged its higher-order processing. Now, if that SMN response is pathologically heightened, maybe unstable because of prior trauma, then the ASC is basically just doing damage control. It's mediating an already volatile aftermath. And beyond that, we really can't ignore the molecular reality, the omics era perspective. Specifically using tools like massively parallel sequencing, it shows us that the functional resilience of every region, including the ASC, is dictated by its foundational molecular architecture. The secret codes of genes and proteins, as the analogy goes. So,
The effectiveness of the ASC as a planner is fundamentally determined by the quality of its underlying construction, which implies that targeted molecular intervention, informed by omics data, might actually be necessary before cognitive planning can even have a chance to succeed.
Let's dig a bit deeper into that control versus influence idea. I'd still maintain that the ASC is the ultimate arbitrator in resolving the specific conflict of moral injury. Okay, yes, input from the OFC might present a sort of weighted list of good and bad choices, and the AVTC retrieves relevant past experiences, basically matching the current scene to old lessons. But the ASC provides the, let's call it, the moral architecture. It ensures that the eventual behavioral output, which gets coordinated through the basal ganglia, our movement manager, and the superior colliculus, the lookout, isn't just efficient, but it's also ethically aligned and emotionally sound. This emergent property, the synthesis of ethical judgment over just reflexive action, that's what separates successful recovery from just repeating crisis cycles. The ASC is where the conscious choice, the will to heal, really resides.
That's, well, an interesting argument for the ASC's role in expression, definitely crucial there, but I would frame its role more as sophisticated synthesis rather than ultimate determination. The ASC is essentially aggregating signals. Now, if the AVTC fails in its job to, quote, remind everyone of good times and lessons, or if the OFC provides a faulty emotional valuation, then the resulting ASC plan is going to be structurally unsound, isn't it? So, to truly understand determination, I think we have to look deeper at those subcortical mechanisms, which brings us back to the supramammillary nucleus and that instantaneous startle response. These are governed by deep functional connections, the source calls them biconditional associations. Think of these as complex, deeply ingrained stimulus response mappings established through learning, probably quite early.
They define how quickly and intensely the SMN, the surprise sensor, acts and whether it can effectively calm down the startle. Now, if this physiological base, this initial precognitive reaction, is fundamentally unstable, maybe due to chronic stress or past trauma, then honestly, no amount of high-level ASC planning is going to fix it at the root. The core fight-or-flight mechanism dictates the initial survival parameters. Cognitive intervention then just ends up managing the residual distress. And what's more, let's consider the anatomical connections here. How does the SMN actually communicate its urgency across the brain so quickly? It relies heavily on structures like the hemifossum. In our framework, that's the connection expert, right? It enables this rapid, diffuse communication across both cortical and subcortical regions. Now, if the fidelity of these biconditional associations running through the SMN and the hemifossum is compromised, while the ASC simply lacks the stable neural scaffolding it needs to integrate inputs cleanly, we're talking about fundamental structural limitations here.
I'm still not quite convinced that focusing so heavily on the startle reflex adequately addresses the cognitive and moral component of moral injury. The ASC's real strength, I believe, lies precisely in its ability to override, to contextualize, and ultimately to incorporate these fundamental physiological reflexes into a learned conscious choice. Remember, the debate is about overcoming the ethical and emotional paralysis. That's fundamentally a higher-order process. For the ASC to function effectively as a therapeutic target, it must be able to utilize inputs that inform coherence. Yes, the hemifossome, the connection expert, integrates these rapid, secret messages, but the ASC then uses this data stream to build a learned, coherent group response. The ASC ensures the final action isn't merely reflexive, but it's actually therapeutic, a product of integration, learning, and self-regulation. By focusing almost exclusively on the SMN, you risk prioritizing the initiating shock over the necessary cognitive restructuring that truly defines recovery. And this leads us neatly into contention 3, the potential limitations of seeing the omics perspective as the primary determinant. Now, I absolutely acknowledge that the omics era, using techniques like massively parallel sequencing to map out the genetic and molecular instruction book for every brain region, well, it offers unparalleled detail on how the brain is built, no question. But treating this molecular code as the primary determinant, I think, risks overlooking emergent functionality. The omics data tells us the potential, and yes, the specific vulnerabilities of each Lego piece. Fine, but the ASE's function, its coordination of an ethical response, is an emergent phenomenon. It arises from dynamic interaction, from learning, not solely from the genetic blueprint. The active teamwork, coordinated by the planner, achieves complex solutions that you simply cannot predict just by analyzing the genes, proteins, or chemicals of the components in isolation. So therapeutic intervention, I argue, must target the function, the network activity itself, not just the underlying structure.
That's a compelling point about emergent functions, certainly. But have you really considered the implications if sequencing reveals significant structural fragility? What if omics data identifies a specific molecular variant, say, a genetic code that predisposes a crucial signaling pathway within the hemisphere, or maybe its connection to the OFC, to fail under stress? If that's the case, then therapy focused purely on cognitive reframing is, well, it's addressing the symptom, isn't it, not the root cause. The omics approach potentially identifies where extra help is needed at the deepest possible level. By reading these unique, secret codes, the strengths and needs of the different regions, we can inform truly targeted precision strategies. Strategies for building a structurally sound, stronger, happier team, to use the analogy. If the structural integrity, as revealed by massively parallel sequencing, is fundamentally compromised, then the high-level planning of the ASC will inevitably collapse under subsequent stress. The molecular instruction book, in this view, dictates the ultimate ceiling of ASC effectiveness. And this brings us to our final point of contention, really, regarding what constitutes lasting resolution. Is it fundamentally cognitive reframing, or is it structural healing? I would argue that true resolution of moral injury requires the stabilization of the entire system to process that hurt inside. This necessitates effective, chemically stable linkages and proper functioning of those key subcortical structures, the BG and SC for ensuring correct action selection, the AVTC for robust memory retrieval and contextualization. If these essential physical components are structurally or chemically compromised, which is precisely the kind of data we can get from omics, and which is often reflected in things like SMN activity, then focusing primarily on the ASC's emotional communication is, I believe, fundamentally insufficient for achieving full, sustained resilience.
I agree that structural resilience is vital, of course, but the very definition of recovery from moral injury demands a cognitive and a moral shift. The ultimate benchmark for resolution, surely, is for the individual to reach a state where the decision detective, the OFC working under the coordination of the ASD, can reliably decide what's fair, right, or safe, so nobody gets left behind. Now that state, that's not a reflexive physiological state. It's a complex moral and ethical judgment, and that process necessitates the ASC's indispensable role in synthesizing the entire moral landscape from all the inputs, the immediate feelings, the physiological reactions, the memory context, potential actions. The ASC is the critical nexus where the emotional trauma is cognitively reframed, coordinated, and ultimately resolved through a conscious ethical choice. Healing, therefore, in my view, must begin with strengthening the function of this centralized planner.
So, to summarize my position, the resolution of complex psychological injuries like moral injury fundamentally hinges on the anterior cingulate cortex. It acts as the indispensable central planner. It provides the necessary integrative and coordinating force needed to synthesize everything from immediate startle responses to complex memories and potential actions, forging them into a coherent, consciously ethical choice. Healing, therefore, requires empowering this centralized hub to foster that internal dialogue, emotional regulation, and rational coordination.
And to summarize my view, while the ASC clearly plays a vital role in the expression of behavior and that final coordination piece, the true determinants both of the immediate crisis response and, more importantly, long-term resilience, are the underlying physiological systems. These systems are governed by foundational, instantaneous processes like the supramammillary nucleus's startle response. And critically, they're shaped by the unique molecular foundations revealed by omics data. Understanding these structural secret codes is, I believe, essential for truly comprehensive support and for building lasting recovery from the ground up.
So we've explored this profound tension within the neurobiological framework. Is decision-making and recovery best viewed as a top-down centralized process starting in the ASC, or is it fundamentally a bottom-up process, physiologically and genetically determined, rooted in those deeper subcortical structures and molecular reality?
Yeah, and both perspectives clearly draw heavily on the evidence about how these specialized brain regions, these friends, interact to solve incredibly hard puzzles like moral injury. The challenge, I think, remains for therapeutic practice. Where is the most effective point of intervention? Is it at the level of high-order planning and cognitive reframing, or is it down at the foundational level of molecular and physiological integrity? Something for listeners to consider.